my dad got a tear down his face and kind of was looking at all of it. He just looked at me and he said, "I'll come and speak to you in a little bit." So he goes up to his room, and I just remember sitting there on our couch in the living room thinking, my dad is upstairs deciding whether or not he's going to love my baby. He's up there deciding everything. He's deciding the rest of my life. And he came back down and he told me that he'd made up his mind, that he was my God-ordained authority, and that it was his decision. The baby was his and not mine. And he decided that I had to place the baby for adoption.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another Fundy Fridays interview. And just like every time, we have a doozy of a guest for you here today. We are with TJ Raphael, the host of the Liberty Lost podcast on Wondery. I don't want to tell too much because I want TJ to explain it. She's going to explain it way better than I can. But today we'll be discussing topics of adoption, childbirth, childbirthing stigma in the church, things like that. Normally, I, as a cisgendered white man, would not jump directly to just handling an interview like this on my own. But Jen wanted you all to know that interviews make her nervous, and she is in the middle of editing her Vacation Bible School episode, literally while I'm recording the words you're hearing. So I'm going to just get that out of the way. But the story we have for you in Liberty Lost is of such vital importance. It is so wild to me that this isn't national news, that this isn't on every headline ever. And I'm really honored to be a part of bringing it to all of you and helping to expose what is going on. One of the many things going on at Liberty University that is not what should be going on, but perhaps one of the worst things going on at Liberty even then. I do also want to highlight to everyone up front that today we're going to be talking again a lot about adoption. I'm going to be using the phrase adoption a lot. That being said, I know adoption is a very broad spectrum thing, and we're going to try and address a lot of that nuance today. Not all of it, certainly, but a lot of it. But I want to highlight that specifically we're talking about infant adoption today, and specifically we're talking about pre-birth arrangement infant adoption. So adoptions arranged with a birth mother who has not yet given birth, and likewise those arrangements specifically we're discussing in the context of private Christian faith-based adoption services. I'm going to use the phrase adoption today, and when I reference something about adoption, if it sounds kind of negative, it's in reference to this particular practice we're talking about today, which I do now, especially after listening to this podcast, have pretty negative feelings about, but I don't want to color the whole broad scope of adoption and family building and all of that with one pen. So I just want everybody to know what we're referencing. But anyway, TJ, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today, even through my gigantic, super long intro. And I don't want to hold you back at all. Can you just tell our audience today the story you discovered at Liberty University and how that discovery morphed into 7 sweeping, epic, incredible episodes of Liberty Lost?
So back in 2022, I connected with a woman named Abby Johnson. She was 31 at the time, and she told me that she had gone through a Christian maternity home on the campus of Liberty University. And I was familiar with the name Jerry Falwell and Liberty's scandal-plagued history. And as soon as she told me where this maternity home sat, alarm bells started going off.
My name is Abby, and I was one of the many young pregnant women kept in isolation at the Liberty Godparent home for unwed mothers. There, I was manipulated into relinquishing my son for adoption at the age of 17. Despite my relentless fight, my son was taken from me.
I'd never heard of this place before. And yeah, that's despite all of the many scandals Liberty University has had. And I started to do some digging, kind of pull the string on this story tip that I got. And I uncovered what one former Child Protective Services investigator told me was, quote, a baby selling operation run out of Liberty University. And he formed that opinion after coming in contact with Liberty University's Godparent maternity home. It's been around since 1982. It was started by Jerry Falwell himself. Falwell started the home to be a solution to abortion. He thought that if he could show America and create a place where young women could go and gestate their pregnancies and then place their children for adoption with nice Christian families, that there would be the political will to end Roe versus Wade in the United States. And so Falwell started this home on campus. It's for girls between the ages of 12 and 21. And a lot of the former residents I spoke to, I'm an investigative journalist, and I've found multiple former residents who have gone through the home. Many of them were offered scholarships, free tuition worth $100,000 in exchange for placing their babies for adoption with a nice Christian couple. And so, yeah, I almost fell off my chair because it seems like one of the biggest scandals in American higher education in the United States. And it's been happening for decades.
And so that I want everyone to know is kind of what we're talking about here. And I don't want to bury the lead. I don't want to be a coy about it or make it into a twist. We're talking about what could very easily be construed as a baby selling operation operating out of one of the largest private colleges in the United States. A trade of pay through scholarships, although we'll get into the pay and the money a little bit here because the money is particularly hinky with all of this, shall we say.
Yes.
But likewise, providing significant financial benefit to the university. There's a give and take, and the quote unquote product being sold here is infant children. And so that's why we wanted to bring TJ on today to discuss this podcast. It is truly that serious of a concern that TJ has raised to public knowledge here. So I want to congratulate you on how absolutely dominant your coverage of this story seems to be online, not only for the idea that you're the first person to really delve deep into the Godparent home, the particular institution we're discussing most today, but also even now. And I encourage all of you, please go look up Liberty Godparent Home. You're going to see exactly how big of a story TJ has busted open here and how exactly at the forefront of this story she is, because it is your name, your podcast, your work, and otherwise it is Liberty trying to cover its tracks. And so I ask all of that just to say, and this is mostly your opinion because this is probably a very complicated, nebulous answer, but how did this go under the radar for so long?
It is wild. And it was a challenge early on in my reporting because I had this one source, Abby, who would come forward to me with this tip. I started interviewing her. I was able to talk to members of her family, her partner at the time, who verified this experience that she had at the maternity home. But there was virtually no other coverage of it anywhere except for what Liberty University itself had put out, which were glowing positive stories from, women or people, adults now, who had been adopted through the home as babies.
Yeah, we found out that we weren't going to be able to have our own children. And so it took all of about 2 days for us to look at each other and say that God's plan for us was to adopt. I was born and raised in Lynchburg and grew up around the ministries that Dr. Falwell has built and has created. And so it was always special to me to know that there was a place that pregnant girls could go and could be ministered to. And when it came time for us to decide where we were going to adopt from, there was no question.
And so it really took a lot of kind of old school shoe leather journalism to be able to build up a universe and find people to talk. And I was shocked also because it seems like something that people didn't bother to follow up on. Last year in 2024, the U.S. Department of Education fined Liberty University $14 million for its mishandling of sexual assault cases. It found that it wasn't protecting employees or female students who came forward to report assault. And buried deep in the government's final report on the school's mishandling of sexual assault cases, the government wrote that the school was forcing, that was their word, the government's word, forcing pregnant students to go to the Liberty Godparent home or face expulsion. And I was like, okay, this, the Title IX case on Liberty has been in the news for like a while. And yet nobody tried to follow up on this one detail. And so, yeah, to your question, James, I don't know how this stayed hidden for so long. I think in speaking with the former residents, the now adult women who have gone through the home, it was an extraordinarily traumatizing experience for them. It came with a lot of shame. It came with a lot of emotional and religious manipulation. And I think a lot of the now adult women who went there as pregnant teenage girls have wanted to put it behind them, have wanted to close that chapter. But honestly, since the series has been released, multiple new women have come forward to me to tell me that they've
Oh
had
my.
similar experiences as well. And so I feel like I've just kind of got the tip of the iceberg here because, yeah, this place has been around since 1982. That's a long time to be operating.
That is unreal. For reference, I'm 36 years old and I was born in 89. So this thing has been around a long, long time and doing this terrible work under the guise of altruism for the entire time it's been around. I say that because this story is kind of unique in that the villain of this story is very, very much a concept. It's the idea of essentially for-profit faith-based adoption services in the US, which are dubiously run and inappropriately managed. That's a hard villain to wrap your head around. If there were an easy human villain to wrap your head around for this story, though, I think it would be Jerry Falwell, who is, ironically, he's a villain we tap into a lot on this channel. I'll say that. And likewise, I think most of our audience is pretty comfortable calling Jerry a villain, so this works well. But would you mind expanding a little bit on his specific role, not just in the development of the Godparent home, but also maybe a little bit more about his role in the broadening of adoption as a concept throughout the US, specifically as an abortion alternative?
As I mentioned, Jerry Falwell started this home in 1982. And according to my research, allegedly he was stopped by a reporter at the Los Angeles Times in an airport there and was asked, Jerry, you hate abortion so much. What are you actually doing to put an end to abortion? And so he said, I'm going to start a quote unquote, his words, a save a baby center. And his idea again was to take pregnant girls and young women who had unplanned pregnancies, have them go to this facility and essentially give them religious education, housing, food. And at the end of it, this maternity home would be physically connected to an adoption agency, a faith-based adoption agency that actually vetted prospective adoptive parents based on how religious they were. I was able to find documents that include, a questionnaire for prospective adoptive parents, and that's one of the 10 poles of being approved to get a child. And Jerry Falwell himself said that he wanted, these children to go to good Christian homes to, help spread the gospel and help spread God's will. In the early 80s, when he's starting the home, by this point, abortion has been legalized for about 10 years, seeing an increase in divorce. So the stigma associated with single motherhood is starting to shrink. In the 1970s and the 1960s, 1950s, maternity homes were all over the United States because of that shame associated with unplanned pregnancy, having a child outside of wedlock. But as the culture started changing following the sexual revolution and into the 1980s, maternity homes began closing their doors en masse. But Jerry Falwell didn't want to see them go away. So he opened up this home and he really had an attitude that adoption can just easily solve this problem for everyone in the United States. He made sure that this maternity home, as I mentioned, was physically connected to an adoption agency. So it was almost like living within an adoption agency. Jerry Falwell alleged that the maternity home would give residents a choice of whether they wanted to, if they wanted to parent their children or place them for adoption.
The Liberty Godparent Home is a home started in 1982 that is designed to help single pregnant women in need.
Many of them go on to mother their children, to keep their children. Some adopt, but some keep their children. So we want to give them life skills to help them recognize what it means to be the right kind of parent, the right kind of mom that can make an impact, make a difference, so that these beautiful, precious children will grow up to become all that God intended for them to be.
But it seemed the messages that the women were getting, it was just nonstop, that they needed to be redeemed for their sin. And that sin, of course, was the sin of premarital sex. It was the sin of sex outside of marriage. And that there was a path to redemption. And that would be to permanently separate from the child they gave birth to make sure that baby went to good parents. My main subject, Abby, she was brought up in the evangelical church. in North Carolina. She explained it to me kind of perfectly. She said, the mentality was that she and the other residents were sinful, and the baby was thought of as pure and sinless. So it made sense to match the pure and sinless baby up with the pure married couple, because otherwise it would be, it would equate to celebrating sinful behavior for this child to remain with the sinful mother.
I definitely battled between parenting and placing because my instinct was to parent, but at the same time, I wanted my child to not grow up on welfare, to have a good education, and to have, most of all, importantly, 2 parents that would love her. And I knew I couldn't give her that.
And so, yeah, Jerry Falwell kind of popularized this idea. I think obviously Falwell's influence within the evangelical community was outsized. I think even though he's, died in 2007, I think his influence, remains and his legacy remains. And it created this culture of shame. I think that was really born out of, the purity culture movement as well.
The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this, because God will not be mocked, and when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe.
And this is just kind of more for me, I doubt. But have the rest of the family kind of picked up this adoption torch that their father first lit? Or maybe are they trying to distance themselves from all of this, especially in the wake of potentially rising scandal?
So I know Jonathan Falwell, who is the current chancellor of Liberty University and the lead pastor at Thomas Road Baptist Church. Earlier this year in 2025, he went on stage. I think it was the weekend of the March for Life rally, and he presented $20,000 checks to the Liberty Godparent Home to, highlight all of the great work that they were doing and saying we, need this service. And even the week that Roe versus Wade was overturned in 22, he put out a video on Facebook saying there's a lot of work that we need to be doing, and that includes expanding the Liberty Godparent Home.
We want to help these young ladies go through these situations, recognizing that God loves them, that we love them. We want to continue to help them with their education and learning how to live.
I wish I could have talked to Jonathan Falwell or anyone from the school, but unfortunately my requests for comment went unanswered. But it doesn't seem like they're shying away from it. If anything, I was looking on social media just the other day, and the Liberty Godparent Home has rebranded its logo on Facebook and Instagram. And it doesn't seem like they're showing any signs of slowing down. And to date, the school hasn't tried to distance itself in any way from the Godparent Home or its adoption agency.
I'm curious, have they responded to your work at all? Or are they just legitimately trying to stick their fingers in their ears and la you out of existence? Is have they anything?
Unfortunately, to date, I've never received a response. It took me 2 years of investigating to produce Liberty Lost, the series. And over the course of a year, I reached out to the folks who run the Liberty Godparent Home, as well as Family Life Services Adoption Agency. Again, that's the home the agency attached to the home. I reached out to them over basically every form of communication. I sent emails to the director. I tried to add people on LinkedIn, on Facebook, called. I actually sent letters via snail mail. And to date, I have never received a response. However, once the series was released, they did provide a statement to the local paper, the Lynchburg News Advance, where they called the podcast, quote unquote, tabloid journalism, just essentially tried to discredit it and said that it was attacking the pro-life work that the group was doing. I'm not surprised that they were attacking the podcast. It doesn't paint them in a very favorable light. I do wish that they would have participated. I am a journalist, and that's why over the course of a year, as I said, I tried to reach out to them. I wanted to be fair in my reporting. Even in the 10 days before we published the series, actually over email and through snail mail, sent a list of very specific things of a former resident told us X, do you have a response? So that every single claim said about them before the podcast published, that they would have the opportunity to respond. And they never said anything back to me. So it's a little curious how they are attacking it now when I invited them to participate all along the way.
I will let everyone know I admittedly knew up front that they had only released the barest statement in regards to TJ's work. And I just wanted to highlight that because it's ridiculous. And we all kind of knew that probably would be how they approached it. But at the same time, I think there's something more sinister going on here, because not only are they trying to ignore TJ's work and all of this other negative coverage of the Godparent home and the program that they operate, but they're expanding it. They're accelerating it. They're leaning into some social forces we'll discuss a little bit later that are very much in play here. I did want to ask, I think it's very interesting that the one paper that they've talked to, or that they felt a need to engage with, was the local Lynchburg, Virginia newspaper in their hometown. I know that's a theme of Liberty Lost that I found particularly interesting, was the sheer number of not just religious, which you would kind of expect, religious forces at play in protecting liberty and the Godparent home, but also the local political and economic factors. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the maelstrom of different effects that were guarding this program from scrutiny and from the public view for so long?
Yeah, I mean, Liberty University has an outsized influence in the Lynchburg area where it's based in Virginia. 5 of the 7 Lynchburg City Council members have ties to Liberty University or to Thomas Road Baptist Church, Jerry Falwell's church. Often the police kind of cycle between the private sector working in public service and the university working in campus security. Multiple people that I found who didn't speak on the record, but I saw that on their LinkedIn profiles, they were Liberty University alumni and then would work for the school and then would work in social services that might, be overseeing foster children or children's services. So, I wondered why. I was able to talk to one CPS investigator and I asked him, why are officials turning a blind eye if this is kind of an open secret? And, he told me it's because a lot of people cycle through the public sector, public safety, whatever, and working with the school, and the Liberty University's influence goes all the way up to the federal level. Alumni have worked within the Trump administration. Multiple alumni have been elected to Congress, have argued cases before the Supreme Court. And because the school locally is a huge economic driver, it's the biggest economic driver in the region, I don't think there's a lot of appetite to rock the boat with Liberty University. And I think that there's also within Liberty a culture of silence and a culture of, you're in the in-group or you're not. So if you're part of the Liberty University community, whether that's you're a student, you're an alumni, you work there, you don't talk badly about the university, it can do no wrong. So I had actually found a former Lynchburg City Council member. He's born and raised in Lynchburg, but he had no affiliation with the school. And when I approached him and I said, hey, I'm kicking around this story. Have you ever heard of this place, the Liberty Godparent home? He'd never heard of it before, and yet he'd lived in town his entire life, literally on the city council. And I think that speaks to the fact that, unless you're part of the in-group, it seems that that's the culture. We don't talk about things if you're not a part of our group. So I think in terms of why local authorities haven't, which I put those questions to places like the Virginia Department of Social Services, which oversees, these entities, as well as the federal government in terms of the Department of Education, there really wasn't an appetite to investigate this at all. When I told the state that this licensed adoption agency, it is currently licensed with the state, Family Life Services, that multiple women reported being pressured and coerced to give up their babies for adoption in exchange for scholarships to Liberty University, I presented that to state officials, and they wouldn't say whether they would open an investigation. They just directed me to an online complaint form.
Oh my word.
And to date, they haven't done anything. And so I don't know if it's a factor of, economic influence in the region, if it's, political influence in terms of where, alumni go to work and former staff, or if it's a combination of all of those things. I don't know what it is, but there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of appetite, at least at this time, to investigate this operation where, again, multiple young women said that they faced this coercion and pressure.
Thank you for discussing that, because I wanted to highlight that it is so many different factors here that protect agencies like this or protect organizations like this. And I think it's particularly interesting with this program's roots in Lynchburg, how it almost feels like every person you talk to in that community is going to have some reason to protect that thing, even if it's not the same reason. Some people maybe go to Thomas Road, and so they're devout and they want to protect their beliefs. Some people, maybe they work at the university or they have family who work at the university and their economic motivations. Some people, maybe it's political. They're conservative aligned and they don't want anything to make that look bad. And all it takes is one reason for people to hush up and protect something so terrible as the godparent home.
Right.
I do want to take a quick step back because there was one thing I wanted you to explain, talking about kind of what led into this. Can you explain for our viewers who are not familiar the baby scoop era and how that plays into everything we're talking about here today?
So the baby scoop era is this period between after World War II until the early 1970s. And yeah, that term baby scoop era, it's what historians and sociologists call it. It's not a term I made up. And basically during this time period in the United States, millions of teenage girls and young women were shipped off to maternity homes by their parents for getting pregnant outside of wedlock. These facilities were all over the country. The reason that this time period is called the baby scoop era is because 1.5 million children were placed for adoption with quote unquote deserving married couples and taken away from, scandalous single mothers during this time period. And this really went on, I think, because of a culture of shame, because of a culture in the United States that said for a very long time that if you were not married, there's no way you could be a fit mother. There are also lots of other social and political factors that go into that. Like, women weren't allowed to have their own bank accounts until the 1970s. They couldn't take out a loan or buy a house. So it would have been also very impractical for a single mom and very difficult. But they were really shamed by society. In the series, we play a clip from a 1965 ABC News special where the announcer in the special says, who is the unwed mother? Is she a tramp? Is she a slut? A girl from the wrong side of the tracks?
Unwed mother. A report by women who have loved out of wedlock and now must face the consequences. Who is the unwed mother? Is she a tramp, a neurotic, the girl from the wrong side of the tracks? Perhaps you may feel she is not the kind of girl you would want to invite into your house.
This is how we used to talk about women who got pregnant out of wedlock. And, in certain communities, we still do. So during this period of time, I think a lot of older women or even, younger people might have heard stories from their grandparents where, you had an aunt or something that went away for a semester to boarding school or stay out of town. And then she comes back and in reality, she was sent to a maternity home. There's an excellent book I would recommend for anyone wanting to do a deep dive on this topic of the baby scoop era. It's called The Girls Who Went Away by Ann Fessler. It really was informative for me. It looks at that time period specifically and how women were treated within these facilities. But yeah, by the early 1970s, maternity homes in the United States start to close their doors en masse. And there are a couple of reasons for that. We are getting better sex education. We've had the, sexual revolution. Women are, entering the workforce in greater numbers. They're finally allowed to open credit cards and get loans and things like that. And yeah, divorce is starting to creep up. And so it's no longer a thing of you need to go hide as a single mother. And we also have the birth control pill, legalized abortion, things like that. And so yeah, this period, it's sort of the boom time. And honestly, I spoke with one sociologist and she said, when you account for familial adoption, so that's say someone gets pregnant and an aunt in another state adopts the baby or a cousin, that the actual number during the baby scoop era is 4 million. 4 million children were transferred from single mothers to other people when you include familial adoption. So that's a really, really high number.
I'm trying to estimate, but that's like the size of Chicago. That's an
right.
Unbelievable amount of human beings who went through this process.
Yes.
Good Lord. And one thing I do like about Liberty Lost is just how much you kept the adoptive parents or the parents who were surrendering their parents to another family. I want to make sure I get that right. How much they were centered in this. And then also, obviously, adoptees, too, although the people you were discussing in Liberty Lost were very small. So they generally couldn't comment.
Yeah.
But I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the Christian adopters on the other side of this, these good Christian families. Because one thing that really struck me, and just in terms of podcast recommendations, and obviously this topic is of vital importance. People need to be discussing this. This needs to be addressed. But this is also just a very well-made podcast. It's Wondery. If you're not familiar, they do great work. They don't let anything go out that's not top-notch. And it's gut-wrenching at times. And it screams at you a lot of times just how wrong a lot of this is. And so I'm curious, with any of the Christians you talked to or the adoptive parents you spoke to, or this that you interacted with, I can imagine a lot of them probably didn't even talk to you. How did you see them reconciling the kind of profit-driven nature of the arrangement that was going on with their otherwise supposedly pure Christian motives? And to be quite frank, was it usually even a concern for them at all?
I did speak to one woman who adopted a child through the Liberty Godparent Home and Family Life Services. And, when I interviewed her, she quoted scripture to me. She still is very much a believer. And she said that she felt called by God to adopt children. She and her husband could not physically have children together. And so adoption seemed like a natural path for her. And even, in our interview a few months ago, she used very similar language to me relating to the fact that this was saving someone, that, she was able to help rescue someone.
The first time we walked in, the birth mom was sitting there holding him. And I remember catching her eyes first. And I wanted to make sure that she knew and that she understood just how blessed we felt and how thankful we were, not just because she had chosen us, but because she had chosen life. And then I saw him, and I was worried. I was honestly worried before I saw him whether or not I would bond with a baby that I didn't carry, a baby that I'd never met, that I never felt. But it was instant. It was literally instantaneous that as soon as I laid eyes on him, I knew he was my son, and I knew that he was ours.
And so I think that most people who did adopt children did not want to talk to me. They're like, I don't want to talk to a journalist. I adopted my baby, 10 years ago. I don't want this person snooping around my family, which I understand. Yeah, so most people didn't want to talk with me. But in looking at the materials that the adoption agency has in terms of its application form, it does to very much seem to center, these very staunch Christian beliefs. And so to me, it would not be surprising if most of the adoptive parents, the people who wanted to get a child from this institution, had the same mentality that, oh, you're saving, a young woman. It's so much better, even if this woman is, 18 years old already, it's so much better for you because you're married and you did the right thing. You didn't have premarital sex. I think that there is very much a savior complex for the folks that were heading to the Liberty Godparent Home. So I wish I would have been able to talk to more people who were seeking to adopt children, but I do have some sympathy for them because they were hoping to build their family. Maybe they were experiencing infertility or something. And they go to this adoption agency, and the adoption agency is confirming their feelings because they want their adoption fees, right? They want them to pay them starting at $30,000 for a baby. And so they're not going to burst that bubble. We didn't actually get to include this in the podcast, but it was kind of devastating to me that one of the women I spoke to, the adoptive mom who wanted to get a baby, she described how when she was approved and was on this waiting list, that the community around her rallied around her and her husband, that they helped fund a nursery for them and get them a crib, get them toys and a changing table. And those were the exact things the girls in the maternity home wanted. Mm-hmm. And we're hoping for that, somebody could help them do this, but yet the community saw them as unfit for primarily because they weren't married. And so that was just so sad that like to hear her be like, our community, our church was so great. They stepped up and they did all this stuff for us. And it's like, why weren't they doing it for unmarried girls? And obviously, I think we know the reason.
And let me tell you, I understand you didn't get to keep it in the podcast, but you didn't lose out on incredible symbolism. That was one of the things I wrote down and one of the things I really appreciated, again, just in terms of telling a story and kind of really highlighting the difficult parts of this. Some of the symbolism in this podcast is remarkable. The fossil watch. Listen to the podcast. I'm not going to tell you about the fossil watch, but it's going to break your heart. But the most immediate symbol, I would say, though, that comes to mind when you're talking about kind of just the strangeness of this whole thing and how uncomfortable it feels down to kind of its core and its bones was mentioned in episode 3, my personal favorite episode of the series, not to pick them apart, but episode 3 really stuck with me. The scrapbooks, the potential parent scrapbooks, which I wrote in my notes, how am I not supposed to compare these to Tinder profiles? and that's what I wrote down. And it's just so dystopian. I'm shocked that the folks at Godparent Home and at Liberty even went that route. How did this overt symbolism, how did nobody go, this is strange. We're using little Facebooks to have these girls pick parents for their baby? Like, nobody kind of, or was, like, in your experience, was everybody just kind of going along with the group thinking, being like, come on, it's great, isn't it?
It's incredibly alarming. One of the women I interviewed in the podcast, Zoe, she kind of summed it up perfectly. And I was like, thank you for saying that, where she said, you know, my mom would never pick a babysitter for me by looking at some pictures and a paragraph in a book. And yet I am expected to pick parents for my own child like that. And yeah, this kind of pre-birth matching, it's common throughout the infant adoption industry. Nowadays, there are digital profiles, even nowadays with the Godparent Home and Family Life Services. I think this week they threw up a post of a happy couple on Instagram. And so, you can swipe through their pictures and learn how great they are.
Oh,
and
my word.
Yeah. And I think that we in the United States we get very uncomfortable thinking about the process of adoption when we start to think about it critically. Infant adoption, there is quite a bit of this kind of pre-birth matching. There is, nowadays there are media agencies that will build you like digital profiles and websites for that. But yeah, I mean, so in some ways, the Liberty Godparent Home and Family Life Services were following industry standards. But one thing that was absolutely different there was the emphasis on faith that was placed throughout these scrapbooks. I did meet in person with one of my sources, Abby Johnson, and she still has the scrapbook of the couple who she wound up placing her son with. And yeah, as we were flipping through each page in the scrapbook, there are images of, vacation Bible school and, them on mission trips and, their favorite Bible verses and things like that. And so this adoption agency was evaluating whether you were good enough to adopt based on how religious you were. And so that was on full display in these scrapbooks. And it was interesting too, because one of the letters in each of the scrapbooks, the adoptive couple would write letters to the birth mother. And it was so interesting to me because the letter started out by saying, like, dear birth mother, we thank you so much for choosing life. God will bless you. But all of the women I've spoken to at the Godparent Home, and it seems the vast majority, they never considered abortion. That was not something they, considered seriously or really wanted. They were brought up in the church. And they were taught that if you end a pregnancy, you are a murderer. And so I view it as like a psychological disconnect where like the adoptive couple needs to believe that they're saving a baby from abortion because that makes them feel good, I guess. And it's also how I think the maternity home can bring in new clientele. But in reality, these are young women who were not interested in ending their pregnancies. They just wanted support to keep and parent their children. And so there is this like kind of eerie disconnect where you're like, what does this letter have to do with anything?
It's just remarkable. To the point where I'm like, I have to ask, and this is episode 4, but are you are you absolutely sure that that baby handoff ceremony wasn't just a deleted scene from Handmaid's Tale? Like and again, listen to the podcast, because I remember screaming at my steering wheel, just like, how is this not obvious for everyone involved?
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know, so the Liberty Godparent Home would often do placement ceremonies, is what they called them internally. And the first time I heard about this, my mind almost exploded. I was like, how is this real? And then after talking to multiple people and confirming that it was in fact a normal practice was wild to me. So they would have the birth mother kind of be in a back room somewhere, and they would set up the dining room of the maternity home with rows of like folding chairs, and there would be an aisle. And so the birth mother would walk down with her baby almost like a bride. Like she was the grand reveal. Once everybody was seated at the ceremony, she would come out with the baby and then walk down this aisle and hand the baby over to its new parents, these good Christian couples. And then, somebody from the godparent home would make a speech about, the great work that they're doing. And then there would be cake and pictures and prayer. And it's just, it feels like something from The Handmaid's Tale, this dystopian ceremony. But apparently, I've talked to multiple people, even people who wouldn't go on the record to me, and I kind of just talked on background, confirmed that this ceremony was common practice. And it's really bizarre and alarming.
To say the least. Good Lord. And this is probably as good a time as any to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the folks we really should be talking about here, which again are the birth parents. And again, going back to episode 3, one thing that I thought was really particularly interesting. There's a scene in which one of the birth mothers, young woman, decides that, or doesn't decide, but rather expresses that she's received prophecy. She's received direct communication from God that she is to be a birth mother, to raise her child, to not give her child up for adoption. And I have never in my life seen the word of the Lord discarded so immediately by everyone in range, all of these religious people. Clearly, that's not what it was.
Right.
Huh? And so how is it so easy for people to ignore the word of God when it comes from the mouth of a teenage mother, I suppose I would ask?
That was a really devastating moment. My main subject, Abby, she describes this moment, and she's 17 years old at this time. She's still a believer. She's since deconstructed, but at the time she really still believed, and she prayed and prayed to God because she really, really wanted to keep her son. She did not want to place him for adoption. And she prayed, like, if this is meant to be, Lord, basically give me a sign. And she gets the sign that she's been praying for that tells her that she is supposed to keep and parent her son. And she goes to her mother and her father to share this, what she believes is great news, that God has shown this to her. And they just say, well, that's not God's plan for your life, because if that's what God wanted, God would show that to us. And, all of the people within the godparent home, as well as the adoption agency, they're all firm believers. Yeah, they don't listen to her. They don't want to listen to her. And to me, it seems, according to my conversations with Abby said that throughout her pregnancy, she was treated, her term was that she had a heathen pregnancy, that, she had done something wrong, that the staff was looking at her and treating her like she had violated her body, and that there was only one path to redemption, and that was through adoption. To order to balance the scales, to make things right, she needed to do this. So yeah, it was easy to, it was a conflicting message, right? If you really believe premarital sex is a sin that you will go to hell for, and then you've gotten pregnant on top of it, yeah, like, we need to redeem your soul. And so we have to do that through adoption, whether or not you believe God has, shown you that you will be a good mother. And yeah, Abby was 17. She was a minor, but she was about to, before this experience, start college that fall. She has a December birthday. So it's sort of like, she was a senior in high school, basically. And so, yeah, I mean, she was young, but like, she wasn't as young as some other people. That might have been a bigger significant challenge. But I think that their beliefs meant that, they didn't want to see a single mother leave that place. So it would be better to get her to place.
My word. And that actually goes into one thing that's also discussed very well in Liberty Lost, is that technically there is another option at the Godparent home. They do, on all their materials, on basically everything, highlight that they also provide parenthood support for young women who want to raise their own children.
Some adopt, but some keep their children. So we want to give them life skills.
Basically, I guess I would say, how is that a lie? How is Liberty lying when they say that?
Through the course of my reporting, I spoke with multiple former residents. All of them said that there were either no parenting classes at all, or that the parenting classes they were given, it would be a stretch to call them parenting classes, that it was basically a Bible class. And then they were told, how bad it was going to be a parent. Even the former staffers I spoke to, I said, hey, I was able to get a hard copy of Liberty's Godparent Home's official rule book. It says that there are supposed to be parenting classes. You worked there. Have you ever seen one? The answer was no. So on paper, they're supposed to offer parenting classes and support for young women who wanted to keep and parent their children, but that never seemed to materialize. One former staffer I spoke to, she said that when she sat down to do a parenting plan with a resident, she came away from the interaction realizing that the parenting plan was basically set up to show you that you couldn't do it, not to actually help you get connected with support services that would help you become a parent. You would be given a piece of paper and asked, well, how much money do you have? And if you're living in a maternity home and you're pregnant and you're, a teenager or you're a young woman, you probably don't have a lot of money. And so it was basically turned back on these girls and young women to make them explain how they would do it. And this former staffer, Sarah P., that I spoke to, she said that that was related to cultural belief, that you are a leech on society if you need social services, if you need, support, if you need Medicaid, if you might need food assistance because you're, a single low-income mom. And so that there was a cultural attitude of, we don't want to connect people with those services. We'd rather just get that baby away from them through adoption, because that's going to be better for everyone involved. So yeah, the parenting classes, everyone I spoke to said they either didn't exist or it was just designed to show you that you couldn't do it. Even, one of the subjects in our series, she was able to keep her daughter, and that's thanks to help and support from her own family. And she said that, yeah, once she left the Godparent home, she never heard anything from them again. There was no, hey, how are you doing? You're a teenage mom. Like, do you need any additional help? Do you need, access to counseling? Like, what are the challenges you're facing? We care about you. There was none of that. She told me that as soon as you had your baby, whether you placed it or you kept your child, that they were done with you.
And I think this all kind of leads to the obvious profit-driven motivation behind everything Liberty's doing here. Jerry's beliefs about adoption and abortion be damned. They're making money off this. Liberty University is making a lot of money off of this, it would seem. That being said, I think most of our audience knows that in the United States, you're not supposed to be able to buy a person. That's
Yeah.
generally considered to be very illegal. But that's kind of what's happening here. So can you explain for our audience exactly how money is moving and how it's changing hands in this arrangement in such a way as to be completely legal, up to the point where a major, academic institution is fully taking part in advancing it without hitting that otherwise obvious law that should otherwise be broken?
Right. Yeah. So the money part is interesting, and it's very complicated. The Liberty Godparent Home and Family Life Services Adoption Agency, they fall under one group, according to their publicly available tax filings, called the Liberty Godparent Foundation. According to the documents that I reviewed, the board of directors are the exact same people who are running Liberty University.
Ugh.
But it seems that where a lot of the money is being made, I was able to see that adoption fees to get a child start at $30,000. That's according to what they put on their website. Again, that's just the starting price. I don't know where the ceiling is on the other end. But Jerry Falwell was constantly using the Godparent Home to raise money. It seems that it was a huge cash cow in that sense. They would send out mailers. Jerry Falwell Sr. was doing hour-long specials on the Godparent home and how great it was. And throughout this hour-long special, multiple times, he says, take out your credit card, call us, donate $400, donate $400. This is how you'll save a baby. And he would parade these pregnant teenage girls down to the front of his church during tithe and donation time and point them out and ask people to donate money to help save these girls. According to the women that I spoke to, the Godparent home was not responsible for any of the girls' healthcare costs. That's actually also according to the official Godparent home handbook that I found. It says in black and white, we're not responsible for your medical care. So that money wasn't going for that. The girls also reported that their own parents had to buy them maternity clothes, had to buy them toiletries like shampoo and things like that while they were staying there as residents. I also saw that the furniture within the Godparent home is donated. And the staffers that I spoke to said they were basically paid minimum wage. So if you're constantly raising money on the backs of these pregnant girls, it's really unclear how that money is getting to them. To me, in doing all this research, it seemed that the Godparent home was a great way to get people to give money to the Old Time Gospel Hour and to Jerry Falwell himself. He even says, we play a clip of him in the show where he says, make your check payable to Jerry Falwell Old Time Gospel Hour when he's talking about trying to raise money for the Godparent home. So these checks were not even being made out to the Liberty Godparent home. So yeah, I mean, for me, at least according to the residents that I spoke to, any donations that were coming in were not really helping them or preparing them in any way for potential parenthood or even to provide them with things, like maternity clothes while they were pregnant. Yeah, the money question is the blurry black box. That was a hard phrase to say.
It's wild to me because, for lack of better phrasing, if not for-profit corporation, why for-profit corporation shape? And I want to highlight something about this, which is this is kind of a uniquely American problem and institution from what I learned in Liberty Lost. How is infant adoption handled around the world, and how do we differ pretty dramatically from that?
Yeah, so in the United States, money changes hands when it comes to infant adoption. Prospective adoptive couples are paying fees to adoption agencies. And it's kind of built out like a little bit of a cottage industry that is really interesting. We wanted to touch on this more in the series, but we didn't have as much time and space. But there are marketing agencies that if you're looking to adopt a baby, they will come and, you'll do special photo shoots with them. They'll help you create a website. They'll help you create a video introduction so that you can come off as great as possible to a birth mom who might be looking to place her child.
If you're feeling like you have got to make your adoption profile today so that you can bring home your baby, you're not wrong. And you're not alone. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the biggest questions that all of my clients have whenever they reach out to me is, how quickly can we do this? Because we all know that an expectant parent has to get to know you in order to choose you to parent their baby. And the adoption profile is the way that you get there.
80% of infant adoptions in the United States are done through religiously based institutions. One academic who I spoke with, Gretchen Sisson, she's at the University of Southern California, she told me infant adoption, if it's not about surviving because of poverty, if that's not the reason you're considering adoption, it's because of salvation. So in the United States, I think adoption is infant adoption. Again, we're not talking about foster care or things like that. It's an inherently conservative and usually religious institution. In other countries, places like Germany, for example, or places like Australia, all adoptions, infant adoptions are managed through the state. So there is no money changing hands for anything. And in those countries, there's a real prioritization of trying to keep a child within a family unit. So that might look like what we were talking about earlier, familial adoption. Like if they're, the birth parents, for whatever reason, cannot physically take care of the child or will not take care of the child, they will try to, get an aunt, a grandparent, a cousin, someone to keep that child within the family circle because it helps preserve their identity. It helps gives them access to medical information as they grow. And really the last case scenario in other countries is to, place a child with strangers who are wanting a baby. That's not to say, other countries They definitely have histories of, especially as it relates to indigenous communities, separating children from their families of origin. There are definitely problematic examples that exist still throughout the world. But, America, we're unique in our capitalism. So we have turned adoption into a for-profit industry.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear just how uniquely American of a problem this is. And in that regard, just like every other uniquely American problem, we will come up with every stopgap solution to maintain that problem rather than fixing it that we possibly can. And one of the things that we've really latched onto in this country, it seems like, especially through listening to Liberty Lost, is the idea of an open adoption. And for reference, an open adoption, for those who are unaware, is an adoption where, at least in theory, the birth parents will be involved actively in some regard in the child's life through meetings or activities and just consistent engagement. They will be involved, and even as someone else is the primary caregiver and the child lives with the adoptive parents, the birth parents will still be involved. And at least through Liberty Lost, it seemed like open adoption is treated oftentimes as like a miracle cure. It fixes every problem you could possibly have with adoption. It seems to me also where one of the themes of Liberty Lost, I noticed, is the bipartisan support that adoption of this type, even this profit-driven, religiously motivated adoption has in this country. Just an incredible amount of support across the aisle. Break this illusion for us a little bit and explain why open adoption maybe is an improvement in some regards, but is not only not a fix for this broader problem, but maybe even in some regards actively detrimental to everyone involved, shall we say.
Yeah, open adoption is the idea that a child will have contact with its birth parents as that child grows, two-way street, whether it's through visits, photos, whatever. According to the women that I've spoke to, and that is birth mothers, that is who we focus on in this series. I think a lot of times in media, we only see and hear from adoptive couples, people who have adopted a baby, or we hear from adoptees themselves. But birth mothers are usually left out of the conversation, and birth parents. But a lot of the birth mothers that I've spoken to, and this is also true when you look at research around adoption and birth mothers, feel that, the open adoption is nice, like having contact with your child is nice, but it creates a kind of unspoken power structure that is a power imbalance, because in the United States, open adoption agreements are not legally binding. They can be closed for any reason at any time by the adoptive couple. And so the birth mothers that I've spoken to, they report feeling like they need to walk on eggshells to make sure they don't do or say anything that upsets the adoptive parents, because they could be cut off at any moment. So it creates this really difficult power imbalance, according to birth mothers, and it can be painful. It can continuously reopen old wounds. And yet, as you mentioned, James, this open adoption concept is how adoption agencies nowadays really sell birth parents on pursuing adoption. Adoption is incredibly unpopular and uncommon around people who become pregnant. About 1% of people who become pregnant will place their child for adoption. It's just not something women and other pregnant people are interested in. It's uncommon for a reason. And so if you're an adoption agency, how do you make sure you continuously get clients? And one way, market research found in the last 20 years is to tell people that they can have an open adoption, that they'll all be like one happy family. It'll be great. You'll be able to see the baby and the child as they grow up. But then, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, I think especially as the child grows older and begins asking or thinking about these difficult questions around, why was I placed for adoption? Feelings of grief and trauma can surface, and it becomes complicated and it becomes messy, and it's easier to just say to the birth mother, we're kind of done with you. We don't want a relationship anymore. There's this organization called Brave Love. They purport to show birth mother stories. It's actually run by the former director of the Liberty Godparent Home. And this is actually something we didn't get to cover in the show, but one of the talking points in the videos, they have, very active on social media. They partner with adoption agencies to create content that they'll show prospective birth mothers to say, oh, it's so great, I have an open adoption. Like, I still get to see my daughter, my son, blah, blah, blah. When in reality, the birth parent doesn't have any power over that situation. As long as they play nice and make sure they don't make anyone feel uncomfortable or rock the boat in any way, things can go on. And I should say, there are some people that have great open adoptions. One woman, Sarah P., who we spoke with in Liberty Lost, she is still in contact with her son and her son's parents. She chose her son's parents. They have a great relationship. She's very happy with them, and they still are all in touch. So I don't want to paint it as across the board as like a negative thing, but there is a lot of complicated dynamics that come with any adoption and open adoption as well.
And I think that what you said there highlights is something important, which is that it can go well in theory and in practice. It can go well. And open adoption can progress as it was explained to everyone and no issues. And they are kind of one big happy family, sort of. But that doesn't remove the fact that putting that arrangement in place fundamentally sets up an imbalanced power structure. There's no way to do an open adoption where everyone is on equal footing. And I say all that to highlight that towards the conclusion, one thing, again, I really love about this podcast is that you do try to focus on ways that these systems can be truly, deeply, down to their bones improved, that there are things that can be changed. And particularly, I think open adoption is trying to replicate some of those things and some forces that are already in motion. Thankfully, birth parents aren't completely alone out there, and there are people who have for a long time been trying to reform these systems. And so I say all of that to highlight that there were 3 terms that were brought up, particularly during that interview. You discussed 3 terms that I'd like you to break down because I think they're just so important here. And those 3 terms are reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and then the third one, which I think is particularly relevant here, family preservation policy. Can you explain those 3 concepts and maybe how they're similar, but also how they differ in some really key ways?
Yeah, so I think most people are probably familiar with the term reproductive rights. And reproductive rights is really whether or not you can legally access reproductive healthcare services. I live in New York. We have lots of reproductive rights here. If I were to become pregnant and I didn't want to be, I would be able to end my pregnancy here. If I needed access to birth control, I would be able to easily get it. And so reproductive rights is about, what the government is legally kind of doing to either help or hinder you to be able to access reproductive health care. Reproductive justice is really a sociological term which takes into account not only what's legally available to you, but whether or not the circumstances under which you become pregnant can support you in whether that's parenting or not. So that it will take into account things like poverty. It will take into account things like environmental justice and where you live. Like, do you have access to clean drinking water? That could impact your decision to become a parent, depending on where you live in the world. It also relates to all of the different things and circumstances surrounding your ability to access reproductive services. If you have to drive 900 miles to access reproductive services, that could contribute to a reproductive injustice. One thing for me, as I reported this series, I started to think about adoption as a reproductive justice issue in honestly a way that I had never had before in my entire life. And I have done many different shows about reproductive health and did one on sperm and egg donation and anonymous donors with 150 kids. I did one on the abortion pill, and now doing this, I had never really thought about in a very deep way about what drives a woman to permanently separate from the child that she gave birth to. And according to, research that is available, poverty is the number one driving factor of adoption. A lot of women who become pregnant will, if they don't want to have that baby, they will try to seek abortion. But there's this really interesting study called the Turnaway Study that looks at women who were denied abortions and what their outcomes were. And only about 5% of them chose adoption in the end. They just instead chose to keep and parent their children. So again, thinking about how rare adoption is. But adoption as a reproductive justice issue is something I started to think deeply about because the number one reason why people place children for adoption is, because of financial constraints, a lack of support, or other kinds of hardship. And so if you were to be able to support somebody through all of those things, to provide them with, whether that's stable housing, access to a decent living wage, access to childcare that could help support them. Maybe it is mental health services, maybe it is a treatment service, whatever. If you were to give a person those things, would they still choose adoption? And mostly the answer is no. And so in that way, not all, of course, because we cannot say everything is all the, across the board. But in that way, adoption can be a reproductive injustice because it's something somebody is choosing out of hardship or lack of support rather than actually actively making a choice to do this. And so that leads us to family preservation policies, because what would make adoption as a survival mechanism more uncommon would be to institute family preservation policies. And those are things that could benefit any American, really, anyone struggling with the affordability crisis we have in this country. That looks, like access to universal childcare. That looks like access to parental leave. That looks like access to healthcare, affordable housing, access to healthy and safe foods, because all of those things are going to especially help vulnerable, low-income people who might already be in poverty, who maybe they're very young, who might risk losing their children forever, making a permanent decision based on temporary circumstances. And so family preservation policies are really just policies that make it easier to be a parent and a human in our society. It's funny, I'm a millennial too. I'm 37. You see these articles out there about like millennials are not having kids, like, oh, there's a crisis, we're not having children. And I think it's, the reason millennials are not having children, it's because of this affordability crisis and a feeling like maybe the world isn't as safe as it was. And at least as it relates to the affordability crisis, that's the same thing that a lot of pregnant women who are considering adoption, that's why they're considering it. Because they feel like they can't do it, that they won't be able to figure it out, and that they'll be seen as bad mothers if they try to do this in, a state of poverty. So investing in family preservation policies not only help to support vulnerable pregnant women, but I believe that it would help all of us in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you addressed that, just because as important as it is to focus on the oppressed in stories like this and the people who really are taking the brunt of the damage of these types of policies, i.e. birth parents and adoptees, it is also very convenient when you can let everyone know, hey, this will also benefit you too. Yeah. These family preservation policies are things like making sure housing, universal health care, things that all of us want that just so conveniently happen to have this wonderful side effect of limiting this practice that I think it's really interesting too. One thing that you brought up and you just brought up now, just how unpopular it is with birth parents and how uncommon of a choice it is, with all factors given, for someone to willingly separate from their child rather than terminate the pregnancy or raise the child even through struggle. And likewise, I think it's fascinating, and I'm sure this metaphor is pretty obvious. The folks who watch our stuff are very smart, and I'm sure this metaphor is really obvious, but I can't help but mention it, just the idea of adoptive parents having a church baby shower for, a baby that's not theirs, when I'm like, it would be just so simple to plug a birth parent right in there and fix all of this. But that's it. For a lot of people, that's not only not ideal, but actively undesirable. And unfortunately, we're drawing close to the end, and not to make things super negative at the end, but unfortunately, these wonderful things like reproductive rights, reproductive justice, these family preservation policies, we may be farther away from them than we ever have been before. So can you explain to our audience, maybe not exactly why that is, but why that is some of the social forces at play in why we may be seeing an even bigger crisis of these exploitative adoptions and these exploitative maternity homes? And to specifically kind of kick that off, can you tell our audience why Heartbeat International is a phrase they should be particularly aware of?
Yeah. So Heartbeat International is the world's largest anti-abortion organization. They have a presence on every inhabited continent. They are one of the driving forces behind maternity homes in the United States. There are currently, there are nearly 500 maternity homes across America. They're in 48 states, and more than a third have ties to Heartbeat. Heartbeat's leadership has openly said we, need more adoption, we need more maternity homes. I have spent a lot of time, probably too much time, listening to their official podcast, the official Heartbeat International podcast, and their, leadership, one of their vice presidents was talking about how adoption is the greatest redemptive choice that you can make, and that it is a biblical choice, and that is sacrificial. And so they're using a lot of the same language, that I saw it being used at the Godparent home.
My instinct was to parent, but at the same time, I wanted my child to not grow up on welfare, to have a good education, and to have, most of all, importantly, 2 parents that would love her. And I knew I couldn't give her that.
To me, that doesn't feel like a coincidence. One of the former directors of the Godparent home sat on Heartbeat's National Maternity Housing Coalition Leadership Council for years. And so, we also see in the conservative, Project 2025 agenda that's being championed by members of the Trump administration that there's an explicit call for adoption as an alternative to abortion. There's also an explicit call to fund faith-based maternity homes. Even if you're not going to get super political, I think, one of the issues that I see is that we no longer feel like I think a lot of Americans feel like we owe, our fellow citizens anything. We're all on our own. We have no more villages. We don't care about each other in certain ways. There's, a feeling among certain communities that I don't want to invest in social services that are going to help someone. And so I feel like, that's a trend. We just saw, the Republican-led Congress adopt a bill that would cut Medicaid. And, Medicaid, in addition to being the largest insurer in the United States, it also covers 40% of births in the United States. So it's not a very pro-family policy to cut that. And so, I do feel like we are very far away from, realizing a society with family preservation policies. But it's good that we continue to talk about these things and call for them. I really hope that if people listen to Liberty Lost, that they come away, with a deeper understanding or deeper thought around choice. Planned Parenthood is a household name for abortion, for cancer screenings, for STD testing. But on the left, there is no household name if you are a pregnant woman in crisis, and you need help to keep and parent your children. So in that way, groups like Heartbeat International, groups like the Liberty Godparent Home, it's created a vacuum where they're able to move into these spaces and co-op things like maternity homes. In theory, maternity homes are vital and great and very much needed, because who goes to a maternity home? You're pregnant, maybe there's a domestic violence situation, or maybe your partner's out of the picture for some other reason. Maybe you just lost your job and you don't have health insurance, or you don't have access to parental care. Your family's out of the picture, whatever it is. That's who finds themselves at a maternity home. And if these homes are being primarily run by religiously affiliated organizations, what is the messaging that they're putting forward about single motherhood, about adoption? We didn't get to cover this in the podcast, but one maternity home out in Utah that opened 2 years ago called Lamb of God Maternity Home, they're reporting a 45% adoption rate among their residents. And, if nationally about 1% of people place their babies for adoption, 45%, that's a 4,500% increase from the national average in 2 years. They're an affiliate of Heartbeat International. And so I feel like in reporting this story, I've seen how it has also been a failing of, secular and progressive institutions to step up and not only help protect the right to choose to end a pregnancy, but the right to become a parent. And if you need help to do that, what are we doing to help people there? And so I hope that people come away, with a new way about thinking about choice. I mean, I definitely did. I didn't quite realize myself when I started reporting this story that, Norma McCorvey, the woman who would become famous under the pseudonym Jane Roe, she was actually a birth mother. She'd given birth to 2 children and were separated through adoption from them. And when she became pregnant for a 3rd time, that's when she sought out the attorneys to, try to get a legal abortion. And that's what kicked off the case of Roe versus Wade. I don't think we quite recognize that case was started by a birth mother. And, McCorvey, she has a very complicated legacy and history, which, could be a whole another podcast.
Yeah.
But she had said that, she'd been pregnant 3 times and was never allowed to be a mother. And that's a really sad and profound thing. And so I think that when we think about what can we do to advance family preservation policies, I think folks on the left and progressives need to be fighting just as hard to maintain abortion access as they're fighting, for things like, policies that are going to help low-income families and honestly, just all of us.
My other question, which was going to be, what do we do? I mean, because I've found few things in this life that have fired me up towards a cause like your podcast, but it's also one of those where at the end you kind of feel like, all right, what do I do with all of this? We live in a country now where we have someone on the Supreme Court who has expressed, Amy Coney Barrett, the domestic supply of infants is a thing she's expressed concern about, like their sweaters. We have Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, talking about how it's every American woman's responsibility to birth one able-bodied worker. The best thing I think it would be fair to say for a lot of our listeners to do, if they're really concerned about this, is to keep those kind of radical family preservation policies and ideas at the forefront of your mind. We've been told in this society that, it's kind of natural. Oh, this set of parents we're going to take care of them because they're adopting this baby. And we kind of treat birth parents as just a consistent afterthought. And we can refocus. We can kind of address the absurdity of we gave $10,000 of baby supplies to a couple that wasn't having a baby so they could take someone else's baby, when there was a person over here who could have used all of that.
Could have used that, yeah.
And probably would have used that as a launch pad to become a successful parent, productive member of society, if you want to use that language, whatever it may have been. And so just, if this is really bothering you the way it bothered me, keep those things at the forefront of your mind and ask not just for reproductive rights, even reproductive justice. Take it even one step further and ask, why can't we take care of folks in that dramatic of a way to help them raise their children? If it's such an important job, let's act like it's an important job as a society. And all of that is wonderful. And I think a lot of it, for some of you, will start with what would be the most concrete advice I could give, which is to listen to Liberty Lost. Top down, finish it. You will see this issue not just from the practical and the logistic, which I think is really important, but also from the deeply, deeply personal. And that's something you can't separate away from the issue of infant adoption and pre-birth arrangements. You just can't. It's not possible. And so I cannot encourage you all enough to sit down, whether you're driving or doing chores or whatever it may be, take some time, add this to your media schedule. It will bring this issue to the light in a way that I don't know if anything else really could. So with that in mind, TJ, just while we wrap things up, can you tell us where people can listen to Liberty Lost, and likewise where they can connect with you? As we heard towards the beginning of the episode, this is not the only work you've done in this space. It's the most recent, but it's not the only work, and it sounds like it's not going to be the only work. You've got a lot left to cover. So where can people find Liberty Lost? Where can people find you?
Yeah, I mean, you can find Liberty Lost wherever you get your podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, whatever. If you like the show, leave a rating and review. If you don't like the show, don't leave a rating and review. No, I'm kidding. And yeah, you can find me. I'm on pretty much all social media under either TJ Raphs, that's RAPHS, or TJ Raphael. And you can check out my website, tjraphael.com, to see my other podcasts that I've made. Yeah, I hope everybody listens. James, thank you for having me on to talk about this. This was awesome.
Likewise. Thank you for coming on. This was awesome. Quick plug for our stuff too. If you like what we do here at Fundy Fridays, please take a moment to consider our Patreon or YouTube memberships. As expensive as $3, as cheap as $1, it gets you the exact same things: access to our Discord, access to our Monday night watch parties, special episodes and content, all kinds of stuff. Really, really cool, really, really cheap. Please also take a look at fundyfridays.shop. We've also got some cool stuff coming there too, new merchandise, some really new merchandise coming up. Including recently the Jennonite Junction Vacation Bible School t-shirt. Please take a look at that. We're very proud of it. And then other than that, a like, share, subscribing, always helpful. If you like the interviews we've been doing on Fundy Fridays, let us know down in the comments. We really like to make sure that people enjoy this. It seems like everyone has, and I know I like doing them. But other than that, I just want to say one more time, thank you again so much, TJ, for sitting down with us. This has been remarkable. This is an incredibly important issue. Thank you for covering it. And likewise to all of you, thank you for taking the time to sit down and listen, and we will see you next time.
More than 1 million Americans a year have had their voices silenced.
Yeah, you heard that right. 1 million. Every year.
You can break the silence. Listen your spare change into a baby bottle.
This baby bottle.
The Liberty Godparent Home Baby Bottle.
You give the gift of hope to a young woman and her unborn child.
Now all we want is change. Your change.